All right, so we've got a pretty hefty reading list all about the American working class. Specifically, we're looking at the white working class in Appalachia. And right at the heart of it all is J.D. Vance's Hillbilly Elegy. Want to dive in?
Definitely. It's a really interesting choice. Vance's book, it goes way beyond simple economics. It's like a deep dive into a whole culture that's facing like massive changes and just tons of hardship. And it's all told through his own experiences growing up.
And his background is fascinating. Middletown, Ohio,
Yeah.
a Rust Belt town, tons of Appalachian migrants.
Yeah. And he spent time in Jackson, Kentucky, too.
Right, right. Then, after high school, he joins the Marines, serves in Iraq.
Then ends up at Yale Law School.
Talk about a journey.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's those totally contrasting experiences that I think give him a really unique perspective on this whole complicated issue.
So for this deep dive, what we want to do is unpack the challenges that Vance highlights in Hillbilly Elegy. Right. So we're talking economic decline, family instability, and this sense of cultural detachment. So we'll look at how these things kind of all work together and affect the lives of people in this community.
What's really interesting is Vance kind of debunks this simplistic idea that just economic hardship alone explains everything about, the struggles of the white working class.
Right.
He says that cultural factors play a huge role, too.
That reminds me of when he was working at that tile warehouse.
Right.
Remember that?
Yeah.
He saw firsthand that even when people had good, stable jobs, good benefits, there was still this disconnect, Like there's this young guy about to be a father, throws away a really good opportunity, and you're left thinking, what is really going on here?
It all ties back to this mass migration from Appalachia to industrial areas like Middletown.
Yeah.
After World War II, lots of families left poverty in Kentucky, hoping to find work at places like Armco Steel.
Right, right.
But they brought their deeply ingrained rural practices with them. Remember the Chicken Man story?
Oh, yeah. The guy raising chickens in his backyard in Middletown.
Exactly. That whole clash between rural and urban norms, it shows just how ingrained these practices were. Made it tough for some of these Appalachian migrants to fit in to city life.
Yeah.
They were seen as, too big for their britches for leaving their families behind.
Right.
But at the same time, they didn't quite fit in with their new surroundings either.
So interesting. It's like they were stuck between two worlds.
And that pressure to go back to Appalachia, even with new jobs and responsibilities in Ohio, it further complicated things, their ability to integrate into this industrial workforce.
It makes so much sense.
Yeah.
It wasn't just about finding a job. It was about navigating this whole new way of life.
Right.
Now, family, that's a huge theme in Hillbilly Elegy.
Yeah.
Vance really emphasizes that fierce loyalty to family and hillbilly culture. Which makes his own unstable family life all the more, striking.
It's true. His mom's failed relationships, the domestic violence, it's just constant chaos. It highlights the tension between that ideal of family and the reality for a lot of people in this community. Makes you wonder how these cultural values survive, under such difficult circumstances.
And his mama, such a fascinating character. She's fiercely loyal, protective, but also prone to anger and violence.
Right, yeah.
I remember that quote, something like, the worst thing is poor folks stealing from each other because it's hard enough as is. It says a lot about the values that are shaped by poverty and hardship. What did you think about her?
Mama, she's this paradox.
Yeah.
She's fiercely protective of her family, but she also, maybe unintentionally, contributes to the dysfunction. It's like she represents both the strength and the cycle they're trying to break.
That's a great point. And you can see how that intense family loyalty creates this pressure to keep problems hidden, too. Like when his Aunt Wee hides that black eye from her own brother.
Right.
Admitting struggles was seen as a betrayal.
Yeah.
Which I think speaks to this intense internal pressure within the community.
It's a double-edged sword. That loyalty can be a source of support, but it can also prevent people from getting help, acknowledging problems that need to be addressed.
Let's talk about education. Vance kind of paints this, pretty bleak picture of the low expectations around education in his community. It wasn't necessarily that the teachers were bad or the kids weren't smart.
Right.
It was more this underlying sense that, academic achievement wasn't that essential for a good life.
He tells a story about his third-grade science fair project.
Oh, yeah.
His mom basically did it for him.
Right.
So when the judges asked him questions, he was totally lost.
Yeah.
It shows this lack of understanding about how to navigate the academic world outside their community.
And there's also that story about him deliberately picking a complex math equation in first grade, not realizing his classmates were all going for the simple answers.
Right.
It's almost like there's this disconnect between how they value intelligence and how it's actually applied in their world.
It raises a good question for you listening. How much does our environment shape our understanding of success? What messages do we internalize about what's possible and valuable?
It's interesting because you also have this message that blue-collar work is valued.
Right.
Like his papa had a solid job at Armco Steel, good stability for a while.
Yeah.
But then Vance's own experience working at Dillman's grocery store, it showed the other side, right? People gaming the welfare system while paying taxes that support it.
Yeah, it's a breeding ground for resentment and disillusionment.
And that's where the changing economic landscape crashes right into their cultural inheritance.
Right. These conflicting messages about work, education, responsibility, they create this confusion, frustration, especially for young people trying to find their place. It's not just about losing jobs, it's about losing a sense of purpose, of identity.
It's like this tangle of contradictions. Work hard, but jobs are disappearing. People abusing the system, but there's a lack of opportunity. How do you even start to make sense of that?
That's a great point. It's not a simple question of right and wrong or deserving and undeserving. It's this web of individual choices, systemic forces, and cultural values that all collide in ways we don't always fully understand.
Religion is a big part of Vance's story, too. He found solace in evangelical Christianity, which he learned about through his biological father. But he describes the church's focus on criticizing others instead of, fostering positive traits.
It's interesting, he was drawn to the strict rules, that sense of belonging,
Yeah.
but struggled with the judgmental aspects. It felt like it just reinforced that us versus them mentality that was already present.
Makes you think about how searching for stability, for order, can lead to a rigid worldview, which might not actually solve the underlying issues.
Absolutely, like seeking comfort in the familiar, even if it's flawed or ultimately limiting.
Then there's Papa's death. That's a major turning point for Vance.
Huge turning point.
He sees his mom's addiction even more clearly and feels the instability of his life so much more intensely. That scene where his mom has a breakdown in her front yard, just heartbreaking. It's this reminder of how fragile family is and the lasting effects of trauma.
That event, I think, really shatters this illusion of stability that was already so fragile. He has to confront the reality of his mother's struggles and his own precarious position in the family.
And feeling like a burden on Mama, it eventually leads him to move in with his biological father.
Right.
Which is ironic because it gives him a temporary break from the chaos of his mom's life.
He finds some stability in a seemingly unlikely place. It shows that even in dysfunctional families, there can be these moments of connection and support. Speaks to the complexities of family dynamics, even in the middle of hardship.
It wasn't all smooth sailing, though, especially with how strict his father's religious environment was.
Yeah.
Did you get the sense that this period, despite the challenges, offered him some valuable insights?
I think it's during this time he starts to see the limitations of that rigid worldview.
Yeah.
He questions the judgmental parts of the church. The focus on external behavior rather than internal change feels like a key step in his self-discovery.
It's like he starts thinking for himself, challenging those inherited beliefs, looking for a deeper understanding of his own values.
Exactly. And that questioning, it paves the way for his decision to join the Marines. He's seeking structure, discipline, a way to break free from his environment, that yearning for control and purpose that's been missing.
Of course, Mama is not thrilled. Threatens to shoot the recruiter if he steps foot on her porch.
Classic Mama. But even her reaction shows how the community views the military, a viable option, a way to gain respect, escape poverty.
In boot camp, it's this transformative experience for Vance. It pushes him to his limits, teaches him discipline, self-reliance, that sense of agency he didn't have before. He forges a new identity, one that values hard work and achievement.
And when he comes back to Middletown after boot camp, people treat him differently. He's earned respect, which he'd never really felt before. It's such a powerful example of how external structures can shape internal perceptions.
So in this first part, we've seen how economic changes, cultural clashes, the complexities of family and community all intertwine in Vance's story. You listening are probably starting to notice some patterns.
Yeah.
How much is personal choice? How much is circumstance?
And how do we unpack these larger forces to understand not just Vance's story, but the experiences of a whole community struggling with these things? Keep those questions in mind as we move on. Next time, we'll explore his transition to Yale Law School and the stark contrasts he finds there. So Vance gets into Yale Law School, and it's a huge change from his life in Middletown in the Marines. He goes from this structured blue-collar world to a super intellectual, incredibly privileged environment.
Yeah, it's like he landed on a different planet. Can't imagine that culture shock.
Yeah.
Here he is, this smart guy who served his country, but he's still carrying all this baggage from his upbringing. You know, those low expectations, that outsider feeling, the fear that he won't measure up.
Classic case of what they call imposter syndrome.
Oh, yeah.
And it's made worse by this huge gap between him and his classmates economically, socially. You know, you listening might relate to this.
Yeah.
That feeling of not belonging, the fear that you'll be exposed as a fraud, even when you have evidence you're not.
Vance even jokes that for all of Yale's talk about diversity,
Right.
everyone basically comes from the same background.
Yeah.
Rich families who've never struggled.
Yeah.
He's surrounded by these kids who had every advantage growing up, while he's still dealing with the trauma of his past.
And it's not just about money, right? It's about, like, cultural capital. Those unspoken rules, social cues that he's never learned.
Yeah.
Think about the fall interview program. Remember how he describes those dinners, cocktail parties?
Yeah. Awkward.
He felt judged as much on his social skills as his academic record.
Totally out of his element. He's smart, he's capable, but he hasn't been taught how to play the game. Like, he's been dropped in a foreign country where he doesn't speak the language.
Exactly. That's where social capital comes in. It's basically the networks and relationships you have. They can open doors to opportunities.
It's who you know.
Yeah, not just what you know. Vance realizes success in this world, it's not just hard work and talent. It's about having those connections, those mentors who can guide you, that social fluency that helps you navigate these spaces.
He's fumbling at first.
Oh, yeah.
Doesn't know the right people, doesn't get the nuances of law firm culture.
Right.
He doesn't even know what questions to ask.
Yeah.
Must have been incredibly intimidating.
It is. But here's where it gets interesting. Despite those struggles, Vance lands a job at a prestigious law firm.
Wow.
And it's not because his interview was amazing or his resume was perfect.
Really?
It's his social capital. Someone in his network, a fellow Marine, vouched for him. Shows the power of those connections.
It really does. It's like having a guide in unfamiliar territory.
Right. And it's something that people from disadvantaged backgrounds often don't have. They're already behind without that same support system. Raises some big questions about fairness and equity.
Yeah. It's like they're playing a game where they don't know the rules. And even when they figure them out,
right,
they're judged more harshly for their mistakes.
Exactly. It's a systemic disadvantage. We need to recognize that.
Absolutely.
And all this is happening while Vance is also dealing with his own issues. Even though he's succeeding at Yale, he's fighting these deep-seated problems. Anger, lashing out.
Right.
He's terrified of becoming like his mother.
He describes himself as like a delayed explosion, someone who needs to be handled carefully. It's a pretty raw admission. Even with all his achievements, he's still working through the trauma of his past.
It is. And his relationship with Usha, his girlfriend.
Yeah.
It's a turning point. She sees his potential, but she also holds him accountable.
Yeah.
Challenges him to break those destructive patterns.
It's like he's finally in this loving, stable relationship.
Right.
But it forces him to face those parts of himself he'd been ignoring.
It really speaks to the power of healthy relationships.
Yeah.
They can help us see ourselves more clearly.
Right.
Challenge us to grow.
This whole idea of personal responsibility versus like cultural inheritance. How much of our behavior is our upbringing? How much is our choices? It's something Vance struggles with throughout the book. I bet it resonates with a lot of you listening.
It's a question without an easy answer. This mix of nature and nurture, individual agency, societal forces.
Even within Vance's family, there are different opinions on how much of his mom's problems were her fault versus a result of her environment.
And that's important. Assigning blame doesn't really help. What matters is understanding what causes these cycles of dysfunction.
Right.
And finding ways to break free.
So how do we create a more just and equitable society? How do we make sure kids from disadvantaged backgrounds have the same opportunities as those born into privilege?
Vance offers some ideas. One is early intervention, providing support and resources to families who are struggling. This could mean programs that ease financial burdens, especially in tough times. or creating chances for mentorship and guidance where kids have positive role models.
He tells this story about buying Christmas gifts for underprivileged children. It reminds him how Christmas was always stressful for him, full of unmet expectations.
Exactly. And it brings up a crucial point. Exposure to different possibilities is so important. Remember that quote from Jane Rex? She runs the transfer student office at Appalachian State. She said, "I knew there was another life out there, and that exposure gives you something to dream for. If you don't see it, if you don't believe it's possible, how can you even aspire to it?"
And Vance makes a good point about how policy can either make these problems worse or help solve them. He says we need to rethink policies like Section 8 vouchers, which often concentrate poverty, and make it harder to move up economically.
He uses this upside-down triangle idea to explain it. When a neighborhood is mostly low-income families, there are fewer resources, fewer role models, less hope.
So it's not enough to just help individuals escape. We have to change the systems that create and maintain these inequalities.
Right. He suggests looking at mixed-income communities, where kids from disadvantaged backgrounds can see different lifestyles, interact with positive role models, and imagine a future beyond their immediate world. It's about breaking down segregation, both social and economic.
Before we move on, I want to ask you listening, what really stood out to you in this part of Vance's journey? What resonated with you or challenged your views?
Hold on to those thoughts. Coming up, we'll get into Vance's insights on personal responsibility, the power of hope, and the need for a more empathetic approach to these challenges facing the American working class.
As we wrap up our look at Hillbilly Elegy, I think it's important to remember that this isn't just a story about despair.
No, not at all.
Vance offers this message of hope, but it's one that's grounded in reality.
Right.
One that acknowledges how complex these challenges are that face the American working class.
Yeah, it's not about pretending things are easy or sugarcoating the problems. It's about understanding that there are these big systemic factors at play while also saying, hey, personal responsibility matters.
Absolutely.
Bit of agency.
Yeah, he doesn't shy away from the tough stuff.
No, he doesn't.
But he shows us that it is possible to break free from these cycles of dysfunction. His own story proves it.
Exactly. And he's very open about the fact that his success wasn't just because of hard work and grit.
You're right.
Remember that line, "I am one lucky son of a bitch"?
Oh, yeah.
It's him admitting he was lucky to have people who believed in him.
Right. People who challenged him, opened doors that wouldn't have been there otherwise.
Absolutely.
It makes you think how many other J.D. Vances are out there.
Right.
Kids with potential who just need a little help.
Yeah.
A bit of guidance.
Maybe a little luck.
Yeah, to break free.
That's the question we should all be asking ourselves.
Yeah.
Talent and potential, they're everywhere, but opportunity is not.
And that's where the policy conversation is so important.
It's
individual effort. It matters, but it's not enough.
right.
We need a society where everybody has a fair shot.
Yeah.
A society where your background doesn't dictate your future.
It shouldn't.
So Vance offers some concrete suggestions.
Like
rethinking Section 8 vouchers. So we don't end up concentrating poverty and limiting opportunity.
He talks about mixed income communities where kids from these backgrounds can see different ways of life, interact with positive role models, and actually imagine a future beyond their immediate surroundings.
Like it's about investing in people.
Yeah.
Not just throwing money at problems.
Right.
Providing those resources, early childhood education, job training, mental health services.
All of that.
So people can build better lives for themselves.
He also talks about this learned helplessness.
Oh, yeah.
That can really take root in communities facing poverty.
It's that feeling that nothing you do matters.
Right.
So why bother?
To break that cycle, you need material support, but also a change in how people think.
A belief that change is possible.
And that's where mentorship comes in.
Right.
And having those positive role models.
Showing people that there are other options.
Other ways to live.
Yeah, when you see someone from your community who's made it.
Right.
It gives you hope.
You start to think, maybe I can do that too.
Vance says ultimately real change required a shift in our pushes him to
interesting. Despite the
realize
potential they're everywhere.
Together, the well-being of one community affects us all.
It's about empathy and understanding.
Yeah.
Bridging the divides that separate us.
Right. Class, race, geography.
It's a big task.
It is. But these challenges, they're complex. No easy answers.
No, but by talking about them listening to each other, working together to create a more just and equitable society.
Right.
we can start moving in the right direction.
Towards the end of the book, Vance shares this nightmare he had as a kid.
Oh, yeah.
He's being chased by a monster.
Uh-oh.
A monster that represents all that chaos, all that dysfunction in his life.
Right.
But in the final version of the dream, something changes.
What happened?
He becomes the monster.
Whoa.
He's chasing his own dog.
Oh, no.
In a fit of rage.
Right.
But instead of hurting the dog,
yeah,
he hugs it.
Wow.
He sees the destructive power within himself.
It's like a metaphor for his own life.
Right.
His fight to overcome those patterns, to break the cycle of violence and despair.
It's about recognizing those destructive forces inside us.
Yeah.
And choosing a different path.
That's a powerful image.
It's a hopeful ending.
Yeah.
It reminds us that even when things are dark, there's always a chance for redemption.
The transformation.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into Hillbilly Elegy,
yeah,
I want to leave you with this question.
Okay.
What monsters are haunting you?
The fears, the anxieties.
Those patterns that hold you back.
What steps can you take?
Individually and together.
To face those monsters.
To create a better future for yourselves and your communities.
Hillbilly Elegy. It's a powerful story.
It is.
But it's just one story.
Keep exploring, keep questioning, keep pushing for a better world.
Couldn't agree more.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. Kate?